Kia ora koutou katoa. My sermon this morning is in two parts. One is based around the reading of David and Bathsheba and Uriah, and the other around the John 6 reading of feeding a multitude. The story of King David, often titled David and Bathsheba, and the wrongdoing is often titled adultery. While a few commentators overlooking the power of a king and how patriarchy worked in the ancient world want to apportion some blame to Bathsheba, or like a Leonard Cohen, skew this as some sort of love story. The majority see David as culpable, not just for his sexual taking of Bathsheba, but for orchestrating the murder of her husband, Uriah. Yet the naming of this incident as adultery continues to persist, and the inference with adultery is that it is about sexual desire and that it takes two to commit. I would suggest such framing of the story was not the author's intent, and instead we should look at the next chapter where the prophet Nathan takes David to task and names and shames both the crime and the king. Nathan was not an outsider who criticized from beyond the walls of power. He was not an Amos or Elijah or a John the Baptist shouting from the wilderness. Rather, Nathan was an insider, an advisor in David's court, at times complimenting David, but also in this episode risking his position by reproving the king. Nathan tells a story. There were two men in a certain city, the one rich and the other poor. The rich man had very many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing but one little ewe lamb, which he had brought up. He brought it up and it grew up with him and with his children, and he used it to eat of his meagre fare, and to drink from his cup and lie in his bosom. And it was like a daughter to him. Now there came a traveller to the rich man, and he was loath to take one of his own flock or herd to prepare for the wayfarer who had come to him. But instead he took the poor man's lamb and prepared that for the guest who had come to him. This is Nathan's story. And in the framing of the story, it is primarily about the disparity of wealth and power between David and Uriah. David, the rich man, Uriah, the poor man. And it is about the abuse of that power by David. The crime is theft. He steals the poor man's one little ewe lamb, that is Bathsheba. We may squirm at the depiction of Bathsheba as a piece of property, owned by the poor man and stolen by the rich. But this is the patriarchal context. The lamb didn't choose David over Uriah. She was taken. And taken when the rich man had plenty of his own women to choose from, including any unmarried woman in the kingdom that he wanted. And given the plenty the rich man had, and the motivation for the crime was not love or desire or lust, but simply greed. The rich man wanted whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted it. He had more, and he still wanted more and more and more. And for 9+ months he thought he'd got away with it. David, the rich man, flaunted his wealth and power by taking the little the poor man had. The writer of these texts in 1 Samuel 11 and 12 wants to underline three things. Firstly, that even a king is accountable for his actions. pity the US Supreme Court, given its recent decision in effect to absolve a president from any crime while in office, doesn't have more justices with Nathan's strength of mind and courage. Secondly, that the purpose of power and wealth is not for the accruing of more power and wealth, but for the protection of and provision for the poor. Lastly, victims of such theft and greed, victims like Uriah, will not be forgotten, and neither will those who are taken like Bathsheba. My second reflection is from John 6, 1 to 14. I choose to read this text as a story of a child who fed God. You can choose it to read it quite differently. As with all the stories about Jesus, this text is a painting, an image, an imagining, based upon a received oral or written tradition, and then adapted and shaped to address a particular community with its particular needs. With this gospel, commonly called John's Gospel, there is nothing historical. So Jesus did not say, "I am the good shepherd," or "I am the light of the world," or "I am the way, the truth, and the life," nor anything else in this book. Rather, the book is a painting by a very talented artist who was part of what scholars call the Johannine community in the early part of the 2nd century, some 70 plus years after Jesus' death. And with the paints on his palette, he creates a kerygma, a preached word, an image that speaks. Some of the paints on his palette come from the stories of Elijah and Elisha. This is why verse 14 has the people say, "This is indeed the prophet." Indeed, if you read the stories of Elijah and Elisha, you will find most of the miracles later ascribed to Jesus. Think paints, palettes, and painters. The Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and Thomas are paintings created for their days with some splashes of style and colour from earlier times. You can choose to read this as a feeding story, part of a sermon on communion, with its references to Passover and to taking, giving thanks, and distributing in verse 11. You may have smiled when the painter put Passover, the festival of the Jews, an explanatory note to his audience who were not Jewish. Or you might have grimaced, for we know this gospel later became a source book for anti-Semitism. You can choose to then take this kerygma of feeding a multitude and hold it up beside our contemporary communion practices and play spot the difference. Like, where is the wine back then, and why don't we do fish today? Like, did anyone check the baptism or membership records of all the multitude who were fed? Like, how come we only get a scrap of bread and a sip of juice when they had a decent feed? And like, the challenge of communion is not about choosing to participate in a personal rite of holiness, but it is a challenge about what we do with what we've got in order to feed the world. You can also read this story as Jesus, the Superman from off the planet, doing his saving thing. Jesus, the divine Son of God, he who makes bread miraculously expand and form in his hands. We might, like the little boy with 5 loaves and 2 fish, bring what we have to share, but it's Jesus who does the magic. Such a reading would have us first and foremost believing in the miracle and the miracle worker, Jesus, rather than doing the miracle and being the miracle workers ourselves. I choose to read this gospel text today as a story of a child who fed God. I choose to read it as a parable, one that didn't happen but is always happening. It begins with a need. Lots of people, lots of hungry people. They might want to see healing miracles or hear from the learned rabbi Jesus, but right now they're hungry. And Philip, the story's foil, gives a correct accountant's assessment as to both the need and the cost beyond the financial resources they have. Note there's no blaming in the story, no blaming of individuals. Who goes up a mountain for a day without taking lunch? Or blaming of parents or communities or synagogues, or blaming of foreigners or accountants. No blaming of government either, the empire or even Caesar. Not that all these were blameless. Hunger, like poverty, like unemployment, like housing shortages, have multiple causes, from the unpredictability of climate to the predictability of greed, from the depletion of economic and emotional resources of the many to the systems that favor the accruing of vast financial resources by the few. But in our story, blame doesn't feature. There's no talk of systematic structural change, which is not to say the Jesus movement were opposed to such change, but rather this story is local and specific. For it's a painting about a child, and it's a painting about the magic of little. The child was low, very low in the cultural hierarchy. The boy had to go through Jesus' minders. Kids didn't get to the front of the queue in those days. Still don't. So an acknowledgement of the story's Andrew is important. Andrew facilitates the access of this boy to Jesus. Andrew sees the boy not as a problem, not as pretentious, not as a nuisance. He simply sees the child having a wish and is prepared to help him have it granted, even if his fellow disciples criticize him. I guess there might have been lots of people trying to access Jesus, people who wanted his touch, his healing, important people, needy people. A boy with a lunch to share wasn't, for most of the disciples I guess, a priority. The boy offers his magic of little things because he too sees the need. And he wants to respond, not by wishing the needy would have planned ahead or go away, not by wishing someone else would do something, but by doing something himself, offering his little, his act of holy communion for a hungry community, his 5 barley buns and 2 fish. His act feeds God. I'm not talking, of course, about some anthropomorphic deity or a super being of any size or shape. I'm talking about an understanding of God as the power between and within human beings that joins us, with us, flows within us as we make love and justice in the world. A power of mutuality by which we empower others. A renewable energy in which we participate that lights us up as we light others up. So I'm talking about a God that needs us, needs to be fed by us, as together we make God stuff, mutual transforming relationships. This is what the mystics mean when they use that phrase about giving birth to God, giving birth to transformative love. So this boy, in making an offering to feed the hungry, feeds and succors this renewing energy called God. He cooperates with God to feed God and expand this life and life-giving energy of grace, as does Jesus. And it is enough. The need is met by enough. May we share our little and know when we have enough.